Hey there, Daniel Hartman, Community Machinery, Sackville, New Brunswick. Behind me we've got some refurbished machinery. We're going to go through the ins and outs of what makes it practical, what we do, how the process works. So we'll start over here with our first example, which is a 10-ton CM Cyclone chain hoist. These are fairly rare. Part of what this involved when we did the initial inventory, we looked at how complete it was. In this case, the hoist itself was so water damaged that it needed to be replaced. Luckily, the hoist interchanges with smaller models, so that was an easy part. Some of these chain wheels were seized up, so being very careful with delicate parts. That's another key thing. So you'll see a lot of machines like this White belt sander has the original tags. So a lot of the time if we're cleaning, painting, refurbishing, we find a way to remove the original tags, put them away for safekeeping. And inventory also what's missing. So if there's a big integral component that's missing, sometimes that will really keep the whole refurb from being viable. Sometimes it's trying to look for a second unit to be able to find good parts, but often if it's something that's missing on one unit, it often gets damaged on others. So there's certain things that it's tough to get around when you're talking about older stuff, and if there's not support from the manufacturer. The next example is this centrifugal blower. It's like a 7 horsepower centrifugal blower. So this was an item that was salvaged. This flange we replaced. This had a longer outlet and a neck down. So it was actually damaged. So that was just as well. So we cut this off, created a new flange, and also created, I believe, a companion flange. Sometimes we'll do that ahead of time, so it saves whoever's doing the work later on figuring out what that bolt pattern is and doing work we've already done. So on a unit like this, we make sure any of the bolt holes, drill and tap, make sure all the threads are good. That's a key thing. And go over any big dents, anything where some of these flat bars here have been bent. So this one here, actually right here, has been straightened out. You can see it's not perfect if you look very close, but we get a good 80 to 90% of what needs to be done. And then stripping all the paint, making sure there's no cracked welds, just going over it quick. You can see here we got our spare parts, and basically we go through everything, make sure everything's good. And the parts that we wouldn't service, like the impeller, that's something we wouldn't service as far as it being a balanced unit. So we'd make sure there's no cracks, and we do that first because that's a key part to the whole thing. So next thing we would go through is, well, before we get to this stage, we would clean, power wash, remove all the grease, the rust, old paint when necessary. Some things, like you can see this old 1955 Aaron's rototiller, which we get into some horticultural equipment, some agricultural equipment, some things of historical significance. You can see a lot of the original patina is left on here. And sometimes there will be multiple coats of paint where that adds to the character and the value of something because it evokes a certain feeling or tells a certain story. So sometimes a lot of those layers of paint are left on. This White belt sander is a good example where it had been brush painted blue. The motor had been replaced. So a lot of times we don't repaint motors as a general rule, but we did find under one of the tags the original color, so we color matched that and went through basically making sure all these machine surfaces were in good shape. And you can see actually here there's this adjuster for belt tracking, which we made a revised unit here just to try and make it easier to track the belt. So this is still a bit of a work in progress. The other thing we often do is go through the electrical. Now this, we still have to add a electrical disconnect switch for a safety lockout on here. But, and the other thing we've added a foot control. So the foot control mushroom switches safety items like that, very important. And this is nice because it allows hands-free operation. So part of the reason we haven't done the safety lockout is because for our purpose here, we try and get things up and running. Things like this belt tracking is a number one concern. And before we get shipped, safety lockout, all those safety upgrades will get double checked. So keeping the cost down as far as what parts are bought at what time and what labor goes in terms of a lot of electrical work. Since we're not electricians, that would often get outsourced in terms of having a subcontractor do that part of the work. So that's one thing we try and be strategic as far as what's happening and when. The other thing we actually added was this mast here to prevent having to have cables running on the floor. So we've got this bus drop grip. So basically the cable could be suspended from the ceiling and the cord run along through the trusses and then plugged in wherever the nearest outlet is. So units like this where I think, this one's 208 volt. So a lot of 600 volt machinery. It's nice keeping those cables up. You don't have to worry about something dropping and having that 600 volt potential there where someone could get injured. So next on the list, we've got this rototiller. This is something that also had a lot of water damage. So the engine was completely disassembled and all the gearboxes. And this was done about 15 years ago, I'd say now. So a lot of the work on this, pins have been replaced. Like some of these pins here we had to remake. There's no factory support for something like this. So sometimes you have to make a lot of parts. Actually, this is another good example where a lot of these levers, knobs, often we would buy in, but a lot of times making a lot of levers because it's not an off-the-shelf item. That's another thing we do when we go through and refurb. As far as the cosmetics and the paint, the importance of paint and making things look nice, it really starts at the top in terms of attitude and keeping a place looking nice, working well, and being able to demonstrate and get everyone on the same page as far as looking after things. And if things look nice, it's easier to get people on board and show and demonstrate that caring. So that's a big part of what we do here in terms of, you can see the shop around you. It's not perfect, but we take a lot of pride in terms of keeping things in the best order possible. So let me just go back to the list here. So after we inventory any missing parts and do a second inspection after the power washing, because we want to make sure there's nothing as far as structural defects and broken welds, anything that was hidden. So then we inventory any of those missing parts, and then, as we said, replace hardware, and we check for any damaged stripped threads, a lot of times rethreading bolts, cleaning rust off bolts. We do a lot of rust removal. So, and all those knobs and pins and things that have been bent and hammered over the years. Now, as far as usability, if regular adjustments are required, a lot of times older machinery will have flathead screws, and we'll replace those, put socket head cap screws, so it takes a lot less dexterity, and it also allows a ball end for misalignment to be able to get on a fastener a lot easier. If you think about something like a commercial sewing machine where a lot of them are still produced to this day with flathead screws, and if you're changing out needles or changing out feet, and you're always using flat screwdrivers, which never fit perfect and never just fit inside a hole the same way a Torx or a hex key would fit in a fastener. It's wasted time, wasted energy. Lean manufacturing talks about all these wastes, even just wasting the potential that we have with what we can do in a day, motion, energy, and just even having to put more mental energy towards going through the motions of what we're doing. So that's why we would change out a lot of fasteners and also put knobs on things where perhaps it does take a wrench or an Allen key and eliminate that to make it so it's really easy one-handed operation when possible. One other thing, we might also create an inspection window. So be able to get inside the gearbox, take a look at something. This press brake behind us, it has an inspection window on the oil tank. And when we first picked it up, we took that inspection cover off. We looked at the oil quality, what was going on in the tank, any rust, any moisture, and we added some drilled and tapped holes to have jacking screws, because anyone who's put covers on with sealant will know sometimes it's very tough to get those covers off. And that's one thing for our last step, which is really making repair notes so other people that come after us, in addition to the repair manual, they will have more detailed notes in terms of easier ways that things can come apart and be worked on more easily. Sometimes there's, especially as machines age, there's certain parts that get replaced more often than others. So that's part of a repair window, or having certain tool kits to be able to take certain tools apart, or make, I know years ago, some friends that had some old horse-drawn implements, like an old sickle bar mower, made a two-piece yoke to go around this part instead of having to disassemble the whole thing. Just making it so there's a bolt-on assembly. So that's a little intangible example, yet, in terms of not having the part right in front of me, but hopefully you get what I'm saying as far as making it easy so things come apart. And then we get into the test fitting and reassembly of subcomponents, and eventually assembly of the unit. Following that, electrical. We talked about that a little bit with the Y-Song sander, and adding things like mushroom safety switch or stop switches, so it becomes automatic. If you can't see or don't want to look at the switch, you're focusing on something else. Like a wood table saw would be a good example. You don't necessarily want to look down at the switch. You want to see where your hands are, what's going on with the blade, that you're holding the pieces clear. Or, something's happening and you don't want to take your eye off a child or a dog or a person who's walked into your work area. As much as we try and prevent these things, the more we're proactive in terms of having a backup plan for when they do happen, the safer we are. So having things like a mushroom stop switch, great stuff. And yes, so the last item, what makes this feasible? What would get someone, taking an older press brake, here's another unit here, this jointer. So this is something where this aluminum guard here was cracked. That's something we welded up. There's pictures of that a few months back on Instagram or the Facebook account. And going through, this knob, this handle, something we replaced, made new fasteners. This fastener here was something we looked through the original part sheet and learned what that part was supposed to look like, made it just in terms of quick turnaround, things we had on hand, and also sometimes making a heavier duty version of what might have been a zinc piece or an aluminum piece that would be more likely to break. So what makes refurbishing something a practical process? So often it isn't. Often it's not viable. And the majority of when someone comes in and they want a significant rebuild done, for us, a lot of times it's business to business. There's an odd time where there's a historical significance to something, and that makes it justified. So a lot of times with business to business, it's easy when you look at your cost of production and you can start plugging in numbers in terms of seeing, price per unit. And sometimes it saves retraining as far as someone's familiar with a piece of machinery, or a new piece of machinery might not be available or might not be immediately available, and having the option to do some rebuilding is a great secondary plan. So the other thing is, if there's multiple units, to make one good unit out of, and those other units can also be left and stripped for parts. Or, one of the things I always like to do is buy the tool I really, really want And then I know if anything does happen, say a lot of times I buy the same ankle grinders over and over again, which are made in Germany. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Walter rebrands the tools made by Metabo. So a lot of times I'll buy a Metabo grinder, and it's a grinder I really, really love. And if anything goes wrong with that grinder, I know I'm going to buy another Metabo grinder so that I'm going to have the spare screws and odds and ends. And if anything goes wrong with it, well, there's a good chance that if something gets dropped or a plastic case breaks, I mean, the motors are most likely to burn out, or a bearing, will go bad and melt the part of it. So if the parts aren't worth buying again, that there's a good chance to be able to make one machine out of multiple machines, one tool out of multiple tools. Anyhow, that can really make it practical when we buy the things that are legacy equipment that aren't going to be easily updated, in terms of things that aren't overly automated. So that can make it practical. And yeah, I think we talked about all the things that might make it practical for rebuilding machinery. Sometimes there's been things, and there's odd pieces of machinery I've posted on Instagram, like there was a pump, for instance, a while back where the wear ring was $1,000, and if you bought the impeller, that was $10,000, and for the housing the impeller went in, that was $40,000. So when there's a lot of money on the table, and some of the stuff can be rebuilt and put into short service, or if it's a backup machine for a production line that runs, even if it runs just seasonally, and all your work is getting done in a 2-month window, well, you don't really want to wait all year to do it differently next time and have backup machinery. So there's a lot of things that can make this type of work very practical. As I say, most of the time it's business to business stuff that people are making money with the things that they are having rebuilt. And I mean, it's part of the reason that I got into this, as far as there were certain things I wanted. I had the ability to rebuild and fix things up, and it feels really enjoyable to me as far as finding a better way. And a lot of times, even just being able to give someone the insight as far as what might be a good fit for them, and trying to give an honest answer, as far as I know I'm the last one who likes to be sold on anything and be pushed into someone telling me why I need to spend money, instead of there's a saying someone said to me, it's not about resources but resourcefulness. So helping people find their resourcefulness. Anyhow, on that note, that's a little bit about things we've refurbished. If there's anything specific you'd like to see, comment below. We'll try and put it either on our Instagram account, which is Community Machinery at Instagram, and on Facebook, Community Machinery as well. Thanks again for checking it out. Until next time.